Hello. Today we're looking at U.S. History, Chapter 12, The New Deal. We start in Section 1, looking at launching the New Deal. The main idea for this section is that in 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president of a suffering nation. He quickly sought to address the country's needs with mixed results. Our learning objectives for this section: we will describe the nature of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt's political partnership. We will explain the initial actions that Roosevelt took to stabilize the economy, and we will explain how the New Deal ran into trouble in Roosevelt's first term. The election of 1932. Americans blamed President Hoover for the country's economic woes. Franklin Delano Roosevelt won the Democratic Party's nomination. He was related to Theodore Roosevelt. He was a distant cousin. He also was a survivor of polio, something that they actually kind of went to great lengths to hide during his presidency. And he had been the governor of New York. Roosevelt promised relief for the poor and more public works programs to provide jobs. He attacked Hoover and the Republicans for their response to the Great Depression. Roosevelt won in a landslide, winning 57% of the popular vote. Now, that may not sound like a landslide, but most elections in this country tend to be between the top two candidates, usually pretty close to a 50-50 split. Oftentimes, within a percentage point, maybe 51-49, something like that. So a 57-43 is a much larger gap than would be normal and does represent a landslide. Now, looking at the Roosevelts, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a winning personality, and he believed that it was the government's job to take direct action to help its people. Eleanor Roosevelt was a powerful political force in her own right, and she helped to change the role of the First Lady. For example, Eleanor Roosevelt really became the First Lady to establish the precedent of the First Lady taking an active role on having an issue that is their particular issue that they focus on. We had seen in the past where many presidents, or First Ladies rather, hadn't been so aggressive in having their own campaigns, their own ideas that they pushed for. But ever since Eleanor Roosevelt, that has kind of been the norm. Some examples, going back into the 1980s when Ronald Reagan was president. First Lady Nancy Reagan was the one that began to push the Just Say No to Drugs campaign. That was her issue. For Hillary Clinton, her big issue was health care. Now, ultimately, her efforts to push health care reform at the time of the Clinton presidency were not successful, but that was her campaign issue that she pushed. Laura Bush, George W. Bush's wife, when she was First Lady, she pushed for education. That was her personal issue that she focused on. And then with Michelle Obama, it's nutrition and fitness. Those are the issues that she pushes for. But that precedent of doing that, the precedent of a First Lady having their own issues that they're pushing for to try to change the nation and to make improvements, that's something that we can trace back to Eleanor Roosevelt. She had many issues that she pushed for, particularly the lynching of African Americans. She really believed in pushing for anti-lynching laws. Franklin and Eleanor's marriage played a central role in Franklin Roosevelt's political success. So looking at their political partnership, if we look at Franklin Roosevelt, he had an appealing blend of cheerfulness, optimism, and confidence. So he came across strong, just generally was a pretty upbeat person. Something that would be very positive for the nation at this difficult time when so many people are suffering. It is nice to have a positive outlook and to know there's somebody there that has some confidence that things can get better. And that Roosevelt fit the bill quite nicely. He also was a very effective communicator. In particular, he was known for his fireside chats. And at this point in time, we didn't have television, but Roosevelt made a practice of communicating with the American public via radio. and he would have a weekly broadcast that he called his Fireside Chats, where he would update the country on kind of the status of the nation. And once again, Americans were very receptive to this form of feedback from their president. He was a reform-minded Democrat, and he believed that government could solve economic and social problems. Now, looking at Eleanor and what she brought with her, she really became the eyes and the ears of the president, which is important. Presidents can oftentimes get isolated. They have very busy schedules that are monitored to the minute. They spend a lot of time with having their aides constantly surround them. And depending upon the president's personality, some people might not want to tell the president the truth. They might want to just tell the president what they want to hear. Presidents risk that sense of not always being completely in the loop. And, Eleanor really did kind of have the pulse in the nation. And, of course, she also had her president's ear as kind of an informal advisor to the president. So she was able to keep him abreast on really what was going on on a larger scale. She also directed efforts to solve major social issues, as I mentioned. The lynching of African Americans. This was something that had gone on, particularly in the South, although it happened elsewhere as well. But it was something that harkens back to the post-Reconstruction period in the South, when African Americans started facing racial segregation. The Jim Crow laws, laws were designed to disenfranchise them, to keep them from voting, and oftentimes they could be targeted with little or no evidence. They would simply be lynched. Somebody can make an accusation, usually a white woman, maybe accusing or saying that she was raped by an African American, and then any African American could be subject to being hung with no trial, no evidence presented against him, no opportunity to mount a defense. Now, of course, this is in violation of the Constitution, but it really wasn't considered to be illegal. And that's one of the things that Eleanor Roosevelt really felt very passionate about. She worked very hard to pass anti-lynching legislation that helped her husband to win over African American support. And this kind of marks the beginning of a major shift, because the original party that pushed for the abolition of slavery was the Republican Party. And so the Republican Party had enjoyed broad-based African American support. Well, Franklin Roosevelt was a Democrat. And so here his wife is aggressively pushing for reforms and pushing to put an end to this practice of lynching African Americans. And this begins to win her a lot of support, and of course that support extends to the president himself. Even though he personally wasn't really pushing hard for anti-lynching laws, the fact that she was helped to pull African American votes over to the Democratic side of the aisle. And the Democrats have enjoyed the African American support as a voting bloc ever since. She also wrote her own newspaper column, and she had the trust and affection of many Americans. Now we're going to begin to look at the role that Franklin Roosevelt played as president, particularly as it dealt with the Great Depression. What actions did he take to try to stabilize the economy? Well, one of the major issues that we talked about in the last chapter were the bank runs, where panicked investors, or not so much investors, but panicked depositors, rushed to the banks to try to withdraw their funds because they were afraid that the banks would lose their money. Well, and like I said, that was probably a smart thing, but the fact that so many people were going to withdraw their money at the same time was causing these banks to collapse. So, they had to find a way to bring an end to this. So what Roosevelt does is he declares a bank holiday. He temporarily closed all of the nation's banks to stop the panic and large-scale withdrawals. So this puts an end to the bank collapses. Now, of course, things are a little bit different today, where people have electronic banking, can access funds 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. But back then, if a bank was closed, you really didn't have any way to get your money out. Well, so he closed the banks. Boom. Now people can't withdraw their money. He's temporarily averted the crisis, and this buys him time to come up with a longer-term solution. So he also passed the Emergency Banking Act, and the Glass-Steagall Act created the FDIC, which we talked about in the last chapter as well. The FDIC stands for the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. It's a federally owned corporation whose sole purpose is to insure bank deposits. Now, this now makes investors feel pretty secure because their bank deposits currently are insured up to $250,000 in FDIC insured banks. Back then it was I think $100,000, but it was still plenty. So for most people there was no fear that the bank was going to collapse when their money was insured, so they didn't need to go and withdraw it, and thus you wouldn't have bank runs. So this was a nice fix to the banking issue. Now, when Roosevelt becomes president, he enters into this crucial period known as the 100 days, or his first 100 days in office. And now that's really kind of become the standard to measure a president's success. What do they accomplish in those first 100 days in office? So this was really a critical period of government activity for President Roosevelt. Roosevelt pushed Congress to put most of his New Deal into practice. The New Deal promised relief, recovery, and reforms. Beyond the 100 days, FDR and Congress passed important legislation after the 100 days. He created the Civil Works Administration and passed the Indian Reorganization Act. Now here are some of the programs that were created by the New Deal. The Civilian Conservation Corps, which helped unemployed young men between the ages of 18 and 25 years of age. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, that helped farmers by paying them not to grow crops. Remember, farmers were suffering oftentimes because farm prices were dropping too low. So by actually paying some farmers not to grow crops, you can reduce the supply, thus pushing prices back up, which helps the farmers that are growing. And of course, the farmers that aren't growing are getting paid to not grow. So that benefits them as well. He also created the National Industrial Recovery Act, or the NIRA. This helped businesses by requiring that businesses in the same industry cooperate with each other to set prices and output. Now, normally that would be considered price fixing and be illegal, but at this particular time, this was considered to be a benefit. It was a temporary solution for a difficult economic time. Also, as a part of the NIRA, they started the Public Works Administration. Once again, with the idea of creating public works projects or government-financed projects that would benefit the public, such as dams, roads, bridges, parks, things of that nature. Even schools would be considered a public work. And labor received federal protection for the right to organize as well. He also passed the Federal Securities Act, which helped investors and restored confidence in the markets. The Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, which is still around today, was created, and they regulate the stock markets. He created the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA, which helped build dams and other projects along the Tennessee River and its tributaries. The New Deal also did begin to run into some trouble. Some radical reactions to the New Deal. Radicals tended to believe that the New Deal didn't go far enough in reforming the economy, and they wanted a complete overhaul of capitalism. Examples of that would include Huey P. Long, Father Charles Coughlin, and Dr. Francis Townsend. All were very outspoken critics of the New Deal, and they were on the radical side. But you also had conservative reactions to the New Deal. They attacked the New Deal as a radical break with traditional American ideals. Remember, traditionally, the government hadn't taken such an active role in trying to regulate the economy. If the economy did good, that was considered good. If it did bad, well, sometimes that's the way things go. There wasn't a major effort for the government to get involved. They just let these things work themselves out. But the Great Depression changed things. Now, more Americans than ever were expecting this. But once again, the conservatives didn't like the change, and so they weren't happy with it. They criticized it. They thought the New Deal would drive the country to destruction. And an example of that was the American Liberty League. Now, looking specifically at some of the leading critics of the New Deal. One that we mentioned already was Huey P. Long. He was a senator from Louisiana. And he believed that Roosevelt's policies were too friendly to banks and businessmen, and he started the Share Our Wealth Society. Father Charles Coughlin, somebody else we mentioned, he was kind of known as the radio priest. He believed that Roosevelt was not doing enough to curb the power of bankers and financial leaders. Dr. Francis Townsend, who we mentioned, he criticized the New Deal for not doing enough for older Americans. He wanted pensions for people over 60. The American Liberty League, which we just mentioned, they believed that the New Deal went too far and was anti-business. It also faced opposition from the courts. Critics of the New Deal feared that it gave the president too much power over the other branches of government. And some cases where the court ruled against him included Schechter Poultry Corporation versus the United States and United States versus Butler.